give it. So if it's okay, I will start now. Okay.
Yeah, it's fine by me. Yeah.
Yeah. First, welcome everyone to this IJCNN 2021 plenary session to be given by Professor Nikola Kasabov. My name is Xin Yao from Sussex in China, also from University of Birmingham in the UK. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Professor Kasabov. But obviously, this introduction can take the whole hour because Nick has done so much work. But I've discussed before the talk, it's better for him to give a talk rather than for me to read his entire bio. So Nick is a fellow of IJCNN, fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, also fellow of INNS College of Fellows. He's a distinguished visiting fellow of the Royal Society, Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK. He's the founding director of Cambridge and professor at the School of Engineering, Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Auckland University of Technology. Nick has provided sterling services to the community. He was a past president of the Asia Pacific Neural Network Society and the International Neural Network Society. He's a member of many technical committees of IJCNN Computational Intelligence Society and was a distinguished lecturer of IJCNN CIS in 2012 and 2014. He contributed to the journal editing extensively. He's editor of Springer Handbook of Bio-Neural Informatics, the Springer series of bio-neural systems, and editor-in-chief of the Springer journal Evolving Systems. He also served as associate editor of several international journals. Nick obtained his master and a PhD from Technical University of Sofia in Bulgaria. His main research interest, as you can guess from title of his talk, are in the areas in the neural networks, intelligent information systems, software computing, soft computing, bioinformatics, neuroinformatics. He has published a whopping 650 publications out of his excellent research. He has extensive academic experience at the various academic and research organizations in Europe and Asia, including George Moore Chair in Data Analytics at the University of Ulster, Professor at the University of Otago, Advisory Professor at the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. So give an example, if you have a good university in Europe or Asia, somehow you might have invited Professor Nick Kasabov as a visiting professor. So there's a long list of achievements he had, including service award he obtained from professional bodies such as INNS, and the best paper awards he obtained from conferences and journals. Without reading the entire long list of his achievements, ladies and gentlemen, can we invite Professor Nick Kasabov to give this keynote speech. Nick, the floor virtually is all yours now.
Thank you, Professor Yao. Thank you, Xin. I should say that first, I would like to thank the Governing Board of INNS and the Computational Intelligence Society for organizing this conference in difficult time. We see that a large number of participants, a very high quality papers. Congratulations to the organizers. This is excellent. And I'm delighted, honored to give a plenary talk. Even though this is the last plenary talk, I can also refer to some previous plenary talks here as well. Let me say that again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will talk about some new inspirations that we can get from how the brain works to develop new techniques, new methods, new systems for so-called brain-inspired analytics. And we are also aiming at developing new types of artificial intelligence that are explainable, adaptable, open. I will make 3 points in my presentation. The first point is that the so-called brain-inspired spiky neural networks that I will use for developing these novel methods and systems can be used for transfer learning in a similar way how the brain does transfer learning. I will explain what transfer learning is about. Humans can transfer their knowledge to such systems and also extract knowledge from such systems. So it may be a way to establish some human machine knowledge transfer for the future. And the presented approach I will illustrate on a particular system that we develop in my group, which is called NewCube. I will start first with explaining what the basic notions of transfer learning are. Then I will move to the inspiration from the brain, because what the brain does is it learns only in transfer learning way. So we can learn from how the brain works to develop some systems. First of all, simple evolving spiky neural networks, and then brain-inspired architectures that indeed can manifest transfer learning. We will look at how we can extract rules from such systems, how we can transfer rules to machines, how we can extract these rules from machines, and then we will actually be aiming at developing in the future open AI systems. I have published some of these methods in my recent book with Springer. What is transfer learning? We all know about traditional batch mode learning, incremental learning, but transfer learning is a type of incremental learning where a model is created on existing data for existing tasks, and it can continuously learn new data and new tasks by partially utilizing previously learned knowledge. And methods for transfer learning have been already developed. I can group them into several types: inductive versus transductive, unsupervised, supervised, semi-supervised. A large number of papers published already. I have chosen only 5 of them, but there are more than 55. And problems and challenges here are that these methods that have been published so far, they are applicable mainly to vector-based data rather than spatial temporal data. Transfer learning methods that have been published are developed mainly for computational intelligence systems rather than human-machine knowledge transfer. The goal of this research that I will present, and it is my research and the research of my team, is to create brain-inspired transfer learning methods that enable knowledge transfer between humans and machines for open and explainable AI. Well, this goal is similar to the goal in what is in the DARPA project for human-machine knowledge transfer. The human brain does only transfer learning. So the process of learning of new categories of data and tasks by partially utilizing already learned categories and tasks in neural connections and adjusting other connections. So all is learned here in one model, in one brain, which consists of many smaller models, all they learn incrementally in a transfer learning mode. And I should say that transfer learning is manifested in the brain at different temporal scales, nanoseconds, milliseconds, minutes, hours, many years of evolution, and at different memory types, short-term, long-term, genetic. A good example of transfer learning in the human brain is learning languages. One language is learned utilizing some part of previously learned language. And indeed, we know about Brodmann areas that are clusters of neurons that are allocated to certain functions. But within these clusters, within many overlapping subclusters that are learned in a transfer learning mode. And if we look at the left and right hemisphere of the brain, we say that the left brain is academic and the right is creative. But when we learn something new in our academic area, we can utilize something that is already learned in the creative area. So there are bridges between these two areas. So some knowledge is transferred during learning from one part to another of the brain. That is how the brain learns in a transfer learning mode. If we take the example of looking at an object and grasping an object, there is a trajectory that is activated in the human brain from the visual cortex to the motor cortex as a result of many sessions of training. But if we have a new object, this area, this trajectory is activated for the person to take this object. So all the time, there will be new object learned, and this trajectory will be slightly extended, modified, using some already connections created before the current session. And if we look at language, speech and language, speech is a very complex, of course, activation of areas in the human brain when we heard a word and we spoke it. And there are quite a lot of overlaps between phonemes and areas in the brain that are learning all the time, new pronunciations. And if we look at the languages share areas in the brain through transfer learning. For example, English and German learned one after another. We can see left hemisphere, right hemisphere. This is the area that is commonly activated for each of these languages. English and Japanese, right hemisphere is a little bit slightly activated, but left hemisphere, very highly activated. So language and speech are good examples and excellent examples of transfer learning in the human brain. But before we talk about transfer learning between humans and machines, do we know how humans transfer knowledge between each other? Well, we know a little bit. We know some, but not everything. And hyperscanning is one technique that measures EEG electroencephalogram data of people who are involved in same activities, playing something. The question is, can we model this synchronization of brains in a computer brain-inspired model and understand more about how this synchronization does? And can we learn from this process how humans transfer knowledge between each other to build new machines that also transfer knowledge between each other? That is an open problem. And one publication by Kelsen et al. Is titled, "What has social neuroscience learned from hyperscanning studies of spoken communication?" And it actually covers quite a lot of review and how this hyperscanning helps to understand how people communicate under different scenarios. They can play music or just have a little chat. Well, enough so far for inspirations from the brain. Let's see what we can do with this inspiration. First of all, I will talk with the smallest unit of computational models called spiking neurons. And then I will move to spiking neural networks that are more sophisticated techniques for learning. And a spiking neuron, we have the information represented as sequence of spikes, trains of spikes. Spike is a binary unit at a certain time. So information contains time in its representation. And this neuron receives spikes over time from many inputs. The membrane of this neuron increases until it gets a threshold. This neuron spikes. And then the membrane goes to the basis level. And again that repeats with this particular neuron. And this kind of neurons are quite known in the literature as different types, like Hodgkin-Huxley. Integrating fire is probably the most applied model of neurons, and here is the very simple electrical circuit of the integrating fire neuron. But how do we achieve learning between spiky neurons? Two spiky neurons are connected to each other, and we can apply the Hebbian learning rule, which says they fire together, they wire together, but here, time is important of firing. If the first neuron fires first, spikes first, and then the second, it's called long-term potentiation, the connection weight increases. In the other way around, the connection weight decreases. As if this happens many times, the first and then the second spikes, the connection weight increases, and it can show some temporal association between these neurons. So time is learned in the connections, and that is the difference between the spiky neural networks and traditional neural networks. Time is inherent in the connections. Now, that was unsupervised learning between these two neurons, but how do we do supervised learning? And what does it mean, supervised learning in spiky neural networks? It means that we want to train this neuron to spike at a certain time when a certain input spiking pattern is presented. So we train this neuron, to changing the connection weights for this neuron to spike when this pattern is presented. And there are different rules to be used. One rule is called a encoder rule. So the earlier the spike comes, the higher the connection weight changes, assuming that earlier spikes are more important here. But we can make this neuron spike earlier than seeing the whole pattern, because we can make it to spike only part of the pattern is presented. So that is called predictive spiking, or early spiking of the neurons. That is also a very important characteristic of the brain, to predict some events and react, spike. Incremental learning, one class of spiky neurons is called evolving spiky neural networks. In evolving spiky neural networks, we have the inputs that are each of these. This is a vector, each value is encoded into spikes using the population coding method with receptive fields. And all these neurons, output neurons, are created for different classes. If we have a new input vector, there will be a new output neuron created. These neurons also can merge. So this system evolves incrementally, and it can learn incrementally new data and new classes. So it has been used for many applications, like online learning, streaming data by Lobo and Elser, for pollution sensor modeling, like Machiar et al., and for some other applications, even for measuring and predicting the pollution in Beijing and Shanghai areas by a very talented group in China. Now, while evolving spiky neural networks deal with vector by vector learning, we have a method that learns not only vector by vector, but the whole spatio-temporal pattern over time to emit a spike if this pattern is presented. So this is called dynamic evolving spiky neural network, that establishes the first connections during the encoder learning, but there is a drift parameter, and this connection weight change based on the further incoming spikes. They either increase if there are spikes, or decrease, there are no spikes. So this method was developed as part of Marie Curie project with the involvement of Giacomo Indiveri in the Institute for Neuroinformatics in Zurich. Now, can we extract rules from spiky neural networks or evolving spiky neural networks, similar to what we did with the so-called fuzzy neural networks? Fuzzy neural networks have inputs and neurons that represent fuzzy concepts. Hidden nodes, they capture clusters of data. And we can express these clusters of data as rules, fuzzy rules, saying if input 1 is high and input 2 is low, then the output is very high. We can do that with fuzzy neural networks. Similar approach can be used for involving spiky neural networks. Here we have one input variable, here we have receptive fields. And if we train these neurons class 1, class 2, we can observe the connection weights, and we can see that the smaller connection weights are here. This is class CI, this is class 1. The larger the connection weights is class 2. Similar way, we can extract fuzzy rules. And for some young researchers who are following this presentation, who don't know the father of fuzzy logic, he is Lotfi Zadeh, the late Lotfi Zadeh. Let me say, from evolving spiky neural networks, let's move to more sophisticated brain-inspired architectures that indeed can transfer learning rather than incremental learning as evolving spiky neural networks. So brain-inspired spiky neural networks have 3 main modules encoding input data into spikes, spike trains, learning in a reservoir or in a 3-dimensional spiky neural network that is structured according to a brain template, and we call it brain-inspired structure, and then output module that classifies, recognizes these patterns from here, and activates certain actions, either prediction or classification or hand movement of a robot. One example of such systems is the so-called new tube that has not only these 3 modules as input, encoding, reservoir, 3-dimensional, and output, but potentially it can include some genetic networks to affect affect the spiking activity in the neurons. I won't actually touch this area at this stage. Now let's start with the first module, spike encoding. How do we encode input information like sensory information like light and sound into spikes? Well, here there are different methods. One is called the threshold based. If the signal increases, there is a positive spike. If the signal decreases below a certain threshold, there is a negative spike. So this is a threshold based method used in the so-called Silicon Retina by Toby Delbruck. And also another way, so we can recover from these spikes the signal, and we can see that it's a recovery depends on the threshold. So there's another way to encode information similar to the human ear does it in the cochlea, and it is called so-called cochleogram way to encode information into spikes before these spikes are learned in the 3D system spiky neural network. But which method to use for practical applications? We have different types of inputs, signals. One study by Balin Petru from Hungary and a team shows that for different types of signals, different types of encoding algorithms, different encoding algorithms are more suitable. More suitable based on what? Based on how well the signal is recovered after the encoding. This is one way to do it. But in another study by Sengupta and team, in our team, he studied not only the recovery of the signal, but how much the signal, the information is compressed if we use spikes rather than real values. And the information can be compressed significantly. We can recover the signal if we want from spikes. And if we want to classify these spiking patterns, the classification after encoding is not compromised versus the classification accuracy when the system works with real values. So that is an advantage of, along with that, spike encoding has another very important feature, which is noise suppression. Not every small perturbation is transferred into spikes because it will be below the threshold for spike encoding. Now let's move to the building the brain-inspired or template-inspired, brain template-inspired three-dimensional structure. We can use different templates, three-dimensional template. One of them is called Talleyrand, and we can go to the Talleyrand demo and download all the coordinates of different areas of the brain as a three-dimensional coordinates. So we can allocate one neuron for each of these area at this particular coordinate. So we map the brain template into the spiking neural network architecture. From this point, we can apply some learning of this architecture, expecting that there will be some more meaningful learning patterns of space and time data. And here is one example that was developed in my team for input to the neurons, and then the neurons develop some connections, and then these connections are making patterns of activities that are classified in different classes. And here's one example also how the online learning happens when spikes come as inputs after encoding. They cause neuron to spike, and neuron spiking means connections are increased, decreased, created. So we can observe that we depart the notion of a black box. This is not a black box. We can open it, we can zoom it, we can see what happens there. What are the connections that connect different areas in a spatial temporal pattern, and we can understand what the source of data is. Either could be a brain data, or could be environmental data, or could be some other data. Now, one recent paper published by Mariam Doborjayan et al., and Mariam is here, I can see her, follows how the clusters of neurons evolve during learning. And this is learning of data of control subjects, and this is learning of data of addicts. So we can see that over time, the tube creates clusters of connected neurons, and these clusters are different for different tasks. Along with clusters that are created, and I call this a so-called spatial feature space, because we have the features around them. There are clusters of neurons. That's a feature space, spatial. Along with that, we can actually trace the so-called temporal feature space, meaning that we can trace how many spikes are exchanged between one feature and another. The more they are exchanged, the more information they exchange, and the more it tells us about, in this case, how these areas of the brain work together. So I think this is a dynamic model. I call it a temporal feature space, and that is another piece of knowledge we can extract from this open box rather than black box. And we can also extract not only this type of info, but we can extract rules, fuzzy rules. We can trace, after training a system, we can trace what are the clusters that are activated one after another. If the training data or the recall data is, for example, grasping an object and lifting the object. And the rules are in the form of spatial temporal rules. For example, every event, one after another, is represented as a function, as a spatial location, time, and probability. And if that happens as a trajectory of activity in this tube, we can say that, yes, this is the class that is performed on the task. And such rules can vary in granularity in space and time, and the rules evolve in this structure through transfer learning. They overlap between each other, and we will see that new tasks learn, borrow some connections from previously learned tasks to actually achieve a faster learning. And if we take these patterns like patterns of activity over time. Some neurons spike earlier, then other neurons spikes later, and some neurons do not spike over time. We can identify what this pattern is the prototype or the output. Is it moving left hand or right hand, or classifying some flying objects? Yes, we can extract this rule that shows the pattern of activity over time and the output that is activated. And when we introduce a new task, the spatial temporal rule that is evolved utilizes some already patterns that are learned here. So we have new classes learned, class 1, INRED, class 2, class 3. They all overlap in patterns of activities in the three-dimensional structure. Now, we looked at how we can shape a spiky neural network using a common template, brain template like Thaler, Ackermann, and I. But can we use some other templates, personalized templates like MRI, magnetic resonance imaging? So this is one recent work by Saidinia and the team. And Saidinia used MRI data of a person to structure a spiky neural network. And this is the MRI. And she developed a system, actually two systems, one in encoding the EEG data, and the other one using real value EEG data. And she and the team proved that such approach can be used to predict few steps ahead EEG data in many channels, not only that are measured, but in channels that are not measured. So that could be used for predicting in the future study of epilepsy or some other diseases. Now, we talked so far about integrating space and time. But what about other information? As it is available, for example, direction or orientation of the signal. And one method that was proposed by Sengupta et al. Suggests a new version of the spike time-dependent plasticity, which is called orientation informed. So if one neuron spikes and two other neuron spikes after that, which one the connection will be increased higher? Of course, we have also this information, the direction. So the direction shows that this neuron is more likely to be associated with this one. So this neuron will have its connection weight increased higher than that one because we use the direction information. And if we use the so-called fMRI plus DTI data, the direction, we can see that the accuracy of classifying the patterns of fMRI in this tube is higher because of the utilized information from the direction. And that is also available in many studies. Now, we talked about so far generally about the brain-inspired neural networks and what kind of operations they can learning they can do. Now, how do we transfer knowledge from humans to machines and back? Well, let's start first with EEG data. How do we transfer knowledge from EEG data of person doing something to machine? And it is, of course, subject of brain-computer interfaces. So we have the EEG data collected at certain spatial locations as channels, and they are collected in milliseconds. So this EEG data can be used to train a system to perform, to understand, to recognize what the human is doing, moving the hand, or talking, or reading, etc. So we can transfer this knowledge from human to machine. Let's see how we do that. Well, let me say that first, let's observe how people transfer knowledge between each other. If one person that is a classical example, and the experiment was done by Zohre Doborgeh and Mariam Doborgeh and Mark Billinghurst and Amir and myself helping them. If one person is moving the left finger and the other person is moving and following this after certain times of moving and following, after the time and following, that EEG data collected and modeled show very much similarity because they synchronized between each other. Can we use this approach to improve teaching and learning? For example, if we teach students something, can we understand how much they follow, how much they synchronize? Well, hyperscaling is one way, and it's a very simple example, but very interesting. Now, extracting rules from a spatial-temporal structure, spiking neural network, spatial-temporal structure, that reflect on how the human does it. It's a new area of study. And I should say that in one paper published by Kumara Singh et al., she observed how humans do one so-called grasp and lift task. She used EEG data of the person and she trained the tube and she extracted the rules for this task. And the rules that are here are very similar to what the human is doing when is planning to grasp and lift the object, lifting the object, and then putting the object back. So here we have the time of activities. Here we have the brain areas, and we can see that this, whatever is observed in the human brain in this task, is extracted from a trained tube. So we can transfer knowledge from how humans do things to a machine, and then extract this knowledge from the machine. Well, the machine can also learn by itself. It can learn new knowledge. We can extract this knowledge again. Now we are moving towards this human-machine knowledge transfer just to touch this subject. Here we have another example where we have 3 movements of hands. That's EEG data, and we train one system on 2 movements, and then we add incrementally the 3rd movement data. So we can see that new connections are created, but there are some common connections used in the 3rd task and the previous tasks, and we can see what the difference between the 3rd and the previous task is, and what is the common connections. So this is something that we can observe in such structure. New tasks create new connections and use some previously created connections, and that is the principle of transfer learning in the brain. And now we actually we see this principle in this brain-inspired structure. And here's one example that was created mainly by Erika and the team. When a person is learning 1, 2, 3, 4 new tasks already, and the connection weights increase, and we can see the difference between one task and the next one. But here we have not only one person, many tasks, but we have many people who are doing some tasks, several tasks, and this knowledge from these people is added to the system over time, and we can see which person is how one person is different from the previous one, and similar to the previous ones in terms of activity. Now, applying this approach to building so-called brain-inspired brain-computer interfaces is something that is quite interesting to follow. For example, here we have one example of moving the control of prosthetics, and it was done by the group of Professor Zhengguan Hou from Cassia, Beijing. Here we have a person, Stefan Schliebs, transferring his knowledge how to control a robot to a system, and the system actually can do that. Sometimes we need to not only identify and recognize one task recognized in the system or one class, but a sequence of such tasks. And one study used finite state automata with knowledge, extra knowledge, prior knowledge of which task should follow which one. And if we use this finite automata after the pattern here is recognized, this paper by Kumara Singhe et al. Shows that there is an improvement in the recognition of the task. And the task could be a very complicated one, like grasping a tennis ball with many fingers. Now, this approach can also be used for EEG data-based emotion recognition. One paper was already presented, Mariam presented it at this conference. Another method by Clarence Stan et al. Develops integrated face and EEG data analysis for a better emotion classification and recognition. It says fusion of multimodal data in deep learning in the brain's spiking neural network, published recently last year in Sensors journal. Now, neurofeedback, yes, we say that the spiking neural network architecture is open box. It's not a black box. So we can see what happens here. If a person is doing something, and this his or her data is recorded and learned here, visualized, the person can actually see what the person is doing as a neurofeedback, improving the person's performance. Then there is a new performance here and new data. So this is a loop that can help a person to improve their cognitive skills. And taking functional magnetic resonance imaging is also possible to create a model, trace the activity of the model, and extract some rules that show what the person is doing according to the model when doing something. And in this case, it is reading a negative sentence. With more fMRI data edit related to new tasks or classes, for example, reading a positive sentence, new rules are extracted that may use previously learned patterns. Now, how do we combine different modalities of data? For example, EEG, that is in milliseconds and collected in the cortical area, with fMRI, that is collected in seconds of the whole brain. Well, this is an open question that needs new methods to be developed. But how do we get also the gene expression data, if such data is available? And gene expression happens over minutes. Well, we have quite a lot of things to work on in the future. Now, good news with the implementation is that spiking neural networks can be implemented in different ways. Von Neumann architecture, John von Neumann and Jonathan Russell, the first computer ABC, neuromorphic architectures, quantum computers, and hybrids. So all of these depend, they can be used to implement spiking neural networks. Talking about neuromorphic systems, they are specialized hardware to, for example, the first one is integrated fire neuron by Carver-Mead. Then we have many developments further in the use for neuroinformatics. Giacomo Indiviri develops chips, FPGA implementations, McGinnity, Elster, True North, IBM, Dharmendra Moda, Silicon Retina, Toby Delbrook, and many other development of specialized or general purpose neuromorphic hardware. And the most important thing is that all these hardware systems are, first of all, they offer high speed, very low power consumption, massive parallelism, and fault tolerance. If we talk about fault tolerance, are all how the brain does repair any damage. Well, before that, I will say that one of the most used, perhaps, neuromorphic systems is the Spinnaker machine by Steve Huber and the Manchester team. Indeed, how does the brain does it? Repair. its faults. This is a question that was addressed in research by the group in Intelligent Systems Research Center, Ulster University, and they created a self-repairing spiky neural network architecture. And it is the work by Leo Harting, Liam McGuire, Liam McDade, John Wade, and others. And the center is led by Damien Coyle. Now, they achieved this self-repair using some tripartite neuron introducing the so-called astrocyte intervention to the neuron to repair the damaged synapses. And that was a very interesting work for several years, published in several papers. Now, quantum computers is also coming, and quantum-inspired spiky neural networks can be run on quantum computers if we have both spikes and features represented as qubits. And there's some initial development in this area. And this is Ernest Rutherford, one of the pioneers in quantum physics. So software development, as I said, spiky neural network software can be very flexible in terms of implementation. This is one development environment, YouTube, that can use both software and hardware accelerators, and it can be implemented in different software platforms, including the cloud-based open source. Of course, the future one is the so-called the chip, the YouTube chip that we are planning to develop. And different platforms can be used indeed to implement spiky neural networks for different applications. For example, this is for a moving object recognition using the dynamic vision sensor plus the YouTube to classify moving objects, and with a high accuracy of classification, because spatial temporal data is collected here and learned, and patterns are classified in an incremental transfer learning mode. So lots of application on autonomous vehicles, surveillance systems, cybersecurity, military applications are possible. One interesting application and one interesting method for mapping the spiking trains that are the result of encoding of moving objects. Here we have moving digits, is to map these spikes in the so-called retinotopic way. So we map the spikes in the visual cortex. And this is the area of the tube that correspond to the visual cortex. If we do that and do the learning part, as Lucas Paulun, one very brilliant student from Germany, so he showed that the classification is superior on 30,000 moving digits. It's a benchmark DVS MNIST data. And I would like to say that YouTube and the other spiky neural network brain-inspired architecture have been developed quite a lot all over the world. And this is my team. You can see some people are here attending the conference as well. We have Mariam, we have Zohre, and we have other people attending. And this is very much international team. I think I should say that probably 12 countries. You can see people from 12 countries here. Now discussions, we have advantages and disadvantages of brain-inspired spiky neural networks, as I said, and I have already mentioned some of them. I would say that probably the main advantage is that spiky neural networks capture time. And I would say time lives in the spiky neural network, and the spiky neural network lives in time. And I will cite one of the Bulgarian educator and revolutionary Levski, who said that time lives inside us and we live inside time. And it was about 150 years ago. Future direction relates to integrating new principles. And I took some principle from neuroscience as the transfer learning in the brain. And now we can actually develop new methods. Bioinformatics, mathematics, chemistry, all these can provide new inspiration for developing new methods And these methods turned into new technologies and towards transparent open AI. Of course, we should be aware that there are also some problems, some ethical problems, and I'll refer to one recent blog which is called www.mindthegap.ai. That would be actually one of several where some ethical issues are discussed. And with this note, I would like to say thank you for everybody who is present here. And I'm very happy to take any questions, of course, within the time allowed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this wonderful talk. And I'm sure you can hear lots of applause in the virtual world. I do have one question from the audience now. So the question is, it seems that there are some similarities between these spiking neural networks and the work by Grossberg and the Kohonen neural networks. Can you discuss the relationship between them, or?
Yes, of course. Let me say that nothing new under the sun, as they say in the Bible. Some principles that are used in this spiking neural network architecture are common brain principles like self-evolving, and that is also the categorical, the evolution of categories in the Grossberg neural networks, the self-organizing by Kohonen. So these principles are also used here. I don't mention them explicitly, but they are the same principles. Of course, we move on step by step, and we extend these principles to a new development. And this new development is more brain-like, more brain-inspired, using brain information presentation like spikes. So I think we are moving in the same direction, of course, step by step, and this is one step further.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very insightful answer. Another question related to your talk, and then obviously people are very inspired by the talk, and then some audience read about spiking neural networks. For example, in event-based camera image processing, there are certain tasks people have been trying to solve using spiking neural networks. So the question is, can you share some insight about which kind of research areas or research tasks which could be tackled best by spiking neural networks?
So let me say that I can be more general and be more specific. The general tasks that spiking neural networks are applicable and suitable and perform better are spatial-temporal data analysis. If you want to capture spatial-temporal patterns over time, that is the spiking neural networks are perhaps a good approach to test. The second part is transfer learning. Indeed, in incremental learning, we can see that the brain learns all the time in a transfer learning mode, and we can do that in spiking neural networks if you want such tasks. If you want some more particular specific tasks, I would say brain data analysis with brain-inspired spiking neural network seems to be a better approach than using, let's say, supported to machine to analyze EEG data or fMRI data. That won't tell you much about the spatial-temporal dynamics of the brain. So any brain data that are spatial-temporal and integrated multimodal, EEG, fMRI, DTI, can be used in a brain-inspired model. Maybe we can also incorporate genetic information, etc. The other application, more specific, is environmental data, where we have stream of data, sensory data that are spatially distributed, but they have patterns of activities over time. How do we capture these patterns and recognize or predict flooding, as it is an application in Malaysia, earthquakes applications, pollution in Beijing and London area, and so all these multisensory informations the data is used and shown that this is a better approach to capture spatial temporal patterns than other approaches like traditional. Traditional methods, of course, are very good in using vector-based, like deep neural networks, face recognition, etc. So spatial temporal data is actually very much, spatial neural networks are recommended.
Okay, that's
my
an excellent suggestion. I think it probably related to the next question by another participant asking if we are interested in using spiking neural networks for robotics. Obviously, lots of robotics tasks has a spatial temporal nature of it. Do you envision any obstacles in implementation of spiking neural networks in robotics, especially in terms of its constrained computational resources of a robot?
Let me say that this is one of probably one of the most natural applications, because we would like the robot to have a brain-like brain, if you like. And sensory information, auditory information, tactile information can be merged in this robotic brain that is brain. Can also download what the robot has done through learning. I think this is the more natural development in the brain in the human machine knowledge exchange. I would like this to see this follow in the future. Very much natural way to look at the development of the brain-inspired robotics systems rather than the technical robots that do things in a different way.
Excellent. I think you mentioned this new cube in your talk, and then there are a couple of people are interested in using a new cube. One question is, if I'm new to new cube and I am interested in spiking neural networks, what should I do as a first task for new cube?
Well, let me say that the first task is to download the code, which is executable code in different ways. We have a MATLAB executable, we have cloud-based version, we have open source. Download and run some of the demos, and the demos are they show some typical problems like modeling EEG data classification, or modeling temporal data like stock index, or some other demo programs. So this is the first step to do. Look at the software, the demo, run it, and see what you can learn. And if you have any questions, come back here.
Okay. The other more specific question is with respect to derivation of rules from new cube, do we get the multiple alternative rules, or do we just get one single rule? And then if we do get the multiple rules, can we do the experiment to test them, which one might perform better, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the case, because if we talk about new cube can be seen as a architecture, as a software development system where you can try several types of learning tools, several types of clustering, etc. They all, and it is also open environment. You can develop your own learning tool and test it because we have the open source as well. I think this is not just one single learning tool, one single model. It is a scalable model where you can use a template of 1,000 or several millions of areas of the brain mapped there in neurons. So it's a scalable, and you can test it under different rules. But of course, the implementation, what we use as student projects, is just one rule. And now we have new development of NewCube where there will be 5 or 6 types of neurons used, 5 types of learning tools, clustering, different classification techniques, etc. So I think it is extendable, scalable approach.
Thank you so much, Nick. And there are a few questions coming in, and I haven't got a chance to ask my own yet. But because of time, I think we have to stop the plenary session formally here. I would like to thank you very much, and then I invite all the audience online to give our sincere thanks to you for giving us such wonderful and inspiring talks. Thank you very much, Nick.
I would like to thank the organizers again to the conference that has been very well organized. I would like to thank the technical support, Leah, who has been also very good to communicate with everybody, to me, and Zheng Guang Ho, and you as a chair. So all team has done an outstanding work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you very much. And then that will be the formally the end of this wonderful plenary talk. Now I'm going to hand over the session to the next one, which will be the award ceremony and then the closing session. So
thank you.
Thank you very much.